But I believe that relationships are the currency to get things done. This internet boom is on, and I said to myself, I got to get back to Silicon Valley. Within a month, I was on a flight back to San Francisco and then made a successful transition into the venture investing. John had this thing called Rankin's Rules of Consulting, and he'd give me all these lessons, and I wrote them down. But rule number one with John was,
Hi, I'm Jack, and welcome to The Company You Keep. If you're building something ambitious, a business, a career, a new chapter, then you already know this. Who you surround yourself with changes everything. But most people leave their inner circle to chance. This show is about changing that on purpose. Each week, I sit down with founders, operators, creators, and leaders to unpack one thing: the relationships that shape them. Not just the shiny ones, the real ones. The colleague who would open a door when no one else would. The mentor who challenged their thinking at the right time. The friend who told them the truth when it hurt. This isn't about networking, it's about the voices we trust when the spotlight's off and the stakes are high. Because momentum is great, but the right relationships, they make it last. If you've ever thought, I'm doing this alone, this show's for you. Let's get into it. Today's episode is with Mark Zawacki, a strategist, connector, and someone who's helped shape the thinking of some of the world's biggest tech companies. Mark's career has taken him from Symantec in the early days of Silicon Valley to high-stakes management consultancy across Europe, to investing and venture capital. But through it all, one thing stands out. He's built his success on the strength of relationships, with mentors, collaborators, and a global inner circle he's nurtured intentionally for decades. This episode is packed with stories. The three mentors who shaped his leadership style, the frameworks that have guided his decision-making, and how his thinking about work, well-being, and connection have evolved. If you've ever wondered how the most connected people think, this one is for you. Let's get into it. All right, Mark, thank you for joining us today. Before we get going, for anyone who doesn't know you, could you introduce yourself, who you are, what do you do, and a quick journey of how you got to doing what you're doing today?
yeah, Jack, thanks for having me. Gosh, how long have I known you? It's been probably 10 years. It's been a while.
It has, yeah.
Close to 10 years, give or take. I hadn't done the math today. So my name is Mark Zawacki, very American accent. Although I like to think of myself as kind of bridging Silicon Valley back to Europe. So kind of one foot in the valley, one foot in Europe. What I do, I'll use words to describe what I do, not necessarily a title per se. Um, I connect people, I connect ideas, I help people see things they can't see. I help move organizations forward in some way or the other. I guess you'd call me a strategy consultant. I do a lot of angel investing as well. But yeah, at the end of the day, I connect people, I connect ideas, and critically, I help in different ways move organizations forward. That would be the short answer.
There is an awful lot of more detail behind all of that, I know. So let's what we want to do is kind of we'll go back to the beginning, start at the start, and kind of work our way forward to where we are today. But many people will know you as like the advisor, the futurist, the expert. But tell us, where did it all start? Where did you grow up? What did you do for education? Like, where was the start?
Sure. I grew up in Colorado. I was born in the outskirts of Seattle, and moved to Colorado when I was 1 years old. So I have no, and then we went back to Seattle one other time when my father was getting his PhD. But my life experience growing up was in Colorado. I'm one of six kids. I'm five of six kids. Uh, my parents were married 66 and a half years. They were together a pretty long time before my mother recently passed, and had a wonderful, wonderful childhood. My siblings are my best friends. We're in touch daily on text. We're super close, and had a great upbringing in Colorado. Very outdoorsy with hiking and mountain climbing and skiing and winter sports, also summers, a lot of mountain lake sailing, stuff like that. But yeah, wonderful. Went undergrad, University of Colorado, um, and yeah, that's my personal background, and lived a long time. We'll talk about it later. But I lived a long time in Silicon Valley. But I've now I'm spending more time again in the mountains of Colorado.
So there's a lot to cover, but let's just Colorado university or college for you guys over there. What did you study? What did you start off with?
Yeah, so it's interesting. University of Colorado, biggest campus is Boulder, and I split my time between the Boulder campus and the Colorado Springs campus. I was a business major, and within the business school, you could, many different options. I started my undergraduate studies in what was then called MIS, Management Information Systems.
Hmm.
This is really business applications running corporates. And so it was a lot of COBOL and BASIC, and yeah, I had courses in those, and it was timely. It's the 1980s. The we were seeing the shift from mainframe technology to just the very beginnings of mid-range systems and even client server. But clearly in the 80s we saw the compute boom starting, and it seemed like a good career choice, and one I'm still in many ways. But I switched my major from MIS into uh, more of a general business marketing undergraduate. But I still had that foundation in learning COBOL and BASIC and other more the sciences of technology.
There'll be people who won't know what Cobalt is, won't there? There'll be, the next generation of software engineers and people running businesses will never have seen those days, I don't think, or heard of them. So and were you a good student, smart, good grades?
So I got into uni at 15. I was still in high school, and there was a program called the Colorado Scholars Program, and I started going to uni at 15 whilst I was still in high school. So I would just take courses, and I had a half a year of university done when I graduated from high school, and but I wasn't terribly studious. I didn't really crack books a lot. I was gifted with a pretty good memory. So if I'd heard it once, I could do pretty well repeating it on an exam. It's kind of been a fortuitous and lucky skill that I've had throughout my career. But yeah, I did that program and had a half a year of university done when I got out of high school. But I didn't graduate from university early. What I then did was take lighter university loads and use up those credits. So I graduated in 4 years,
Yeah.
uh, but I just had those chips to play, and I used what I would built up in advance to just have kind of a more casual college experience.
bit more a bit more fun, a bit more time, free time to explore what it's like to be growing up in Colorado, I bet.
Yeah, and I do a bit of summer school as well, so I kept well ahead, and I graduated. And frankly, I won't say coasting or taking it easy, but I was able to get through a 4-year program with, in some ways, kind of a lighter load. It kind of smoothed it out. It's good.
And even back then, yeah, would you have been able? What would have been with your upbringing and ambition? What would success have looked like? What would if you'd have fast forwarded your life 20 years time back then? Would you have been able to kind of plot out this is the kind of thing that I'm going to do, and would it be similar to what you've actually done, or would you back then have thought something completely different?
I thought about a career in in business, and I knew I was going to go into a business field. It wasn't going to be medicine or engineering or account. It was going to be in business. I didn't have clarity on what aspect of business I would go into per se, but I just knew it'd be in business, and still doing that all these decades later. So, yeah, so I'm still, with a business career, largely in the tech industry, but it's still business based. So what I thought I'd be doing at in my university years is still happening.
Yeah. And then what was the first job? Right, finished university, got your undergrad. What was the first kind of job or career or business? Where did you go next?
Well, let me rewind the tape a little bit to kind of set the context. One of my very early kind of mentors, advisors, influencers uh, was my dad, my own father. My dad goes by many different names, uh, but Dr. Robert Zawacki, Bob Zawacki, Dr. Bob. My dad was a management consultant. He was also an academic. He was a business school professor at the University of Colorado. In fact, I had him as a class and I got an A, but I had to work harder for that A, I believe.
Yeah, I bet. I bet.
I had to work a lot harder for that A. But my point being is, growing up, I had this mentor I had in the house. We are always talking about business. He was an international consultant, um, primarily in Europe. So he was forever in Europe. He was going, he was making 15, 20 trips a year to Europe from Colorado. He had a crazy, crazy schedule back and forth. And so, to your question of how I really thought about business and how I got into it and how I thought about tech, I remember very well. I was either finishing high school or I was in university, but somewhere, I don't know, somewhere between the age of 18 and 20, I remember a book that he was given as a gift. I think it might have been like part of speaking or something. And he was given a book about Silicon Valley and specifically the venture capital industry. And nobody, we didn't even call them VCs. There wasn't the acronym out there. They were called venture capitalists. And I read this book. I was flipping through it. It's just lying on the coffee table in the lounge in the living room. And I was fascinated. And this book talked about several of these so-called venture capitalists. And I'm guessing the book would have been written in the first half of the 1980s, may have come out, mid 80s, but somewhere in that time frame. And it mentioned several of these so-called VCs, again, venture capitalists. And one of them stuck in my mind was a guy named Arthur Rock. And Arthur Rock, by the way, I looked him up the other day, still alive, turns 99 in August, a couple,
Yeah.
weeks away, still alive. But he famously put money in two startups. One was called Intel, and he was the first chairman of Intel. And secondarily, he put money in a little startup called Apple, and he was the first investor in Apple. And even in the 80s, when I was just starting my career, those were both very influential companies. So to put Arthur Rock and this book in context, um, in the early 80s, we had the first IBM PCs coming out. And conventional wisdom, everyone knew Intel because Intel was the chips inside. And they were on the cover of Business Week and they were on the cover of Time Magazine. And you knew that Intel was an important company. And then secondarily, you knew Apple already in the 80s in the early 80s was an important company. Who's this guy, Steve Jobs, that wears jeans to work and, is coming up. The first Apple had shipped. And, you know, and I remember the Time Magazine's a big US based general interest magazine. And, we had a subscription at the home. And, who's this guy worth $100 million? He's 23 years old and he's worth $100 million. And there was Steve Jobs sitting cross-legged on the cover, and it talked about a pretty unorthodox lifestyle that he had. So that really, really piqued my curiosity of like, hey, what's this thing called Silicon Valley, and what's going on out there, and who's this guy Arthur Rock, and he seems to be connected to a lot of this activity. And the articles at that time you'd read in Business Week and Time and others hinted at this thing called Silicon Valley. And you had the early Atari games company, and then a few more things were starting to bubble up and percolate. And I said to myself, I said, that sounds interesting. It sounds like there's got to be a business side to all of that. That sounds really interesting. And then coincidentally, I was dating a girl at the time that later became my first wife, and then later became my first ex-wife. But my girlfriend at the time was from that area. She was from Silicon Valley, and she had moved out to Colorado in high school. And so we got out of uni at about the same time, and we said, let's go out there and figure it out. And so we packed up and moved out to Silicon Valley, and I landed at a tiny startup, very serendipitous, kind of, lucky. I didn't plan it per se, but I joined a little tiny 75 person startup. I was employee 75 at Symantec. And Symantec, as many of the listeners know, became one of the largest software companies ever. And I was uh, very early in my career there. It was really my first job out of uni, and joined Symantec. And I kind of had two roles. I started out really just being the IT guy. I was the break and fix guy. I wasn't professionally trained. There wasn't a lot of certifications around it. This was in the mid to late 1980s, and I was just the break and fix guy. And everyone had a personal computer, and then we started networking all those computers together with products like Novell NetWare, and you had to have servers, and those servers were there for email and for file sharing and for printing and other communications. And the internet was nascent. We first started hooking all the computers up to talk to other sites with just banks and banks of modems and X25 gateways. And there's no certifications. You just kind of had to rock it. I had a small team of about 5 people, and we were doing this globally. And Symantec was growing extraordinarily fast at that time. They were doing a number of acquisitions. Fascinating. That's a great story in and of itself. I can tell you how that all happened. And I was just kind of at the right place at the right time. Who's Kleiner Perkins, and what are these things called stock options, and how do they work? And one of probably my first real mentor, great guy I'm still in touch with today, is a Kiwi, New Zealander, a guy named Bob Dykes. And Bob was the CFO of Symantec. And Bob hired me and kind of let me loose. So I started out as kind of this break and fix IT guy that just kept the personal computer infrastructure running globally. And then he pulled me into a business development role. And hey, Mark, we're thinking about doing this acquisition. Here's some software. Can you look at it, make heads or tails of it? And let's talk in a couple of weeks on what you saw. And I'd looked at things like CC Mail. We thought about going into the email enterprise business. And I remember having a lot of secret meetings with CC Mail, and at the time, a French founder called Philippe Courteau, and uh, having those kind of secretive discussions, running over there and figuring out what they had and how did it fit with what we were doing as a company. But yeah, my first real mentor guy, I'm still in touch with today, wonderful, wonderful guy, Bob Dykes. And he still lives in Silicon Valley, and he was an early uh, LP in several different venture funds. Had Bob himself has had a remarkable career, but Symantec was very foundational in my tech background, as well as having my first real mentor that gave me a shot.
And what a story, like, what a remarkable. I imagine you could speak for hours just about the few years you were there. You were there. What was like the foundational? What did you learn there? What was like the main skills that you learned coming out of university, first real job in the real world? What were like the foundational skills that you learned as part of that?
Well, as I briefly mentioned earlier, I went from an MIS degree, it's kind of like the computer science of business, So I had this management information systems major, and I flip it over to marketing, and suddenly I find myself at Symantec in a tech company, and I'm more back to the MIS kind of skills and less the marketing skills. I was doing nothing marketing related, and I was back to understanding kind of the tech side. But Bob, in hindsight, when you really think about what Bob did well, is he understood autonomy, and he gave me a lot of freedom to go do stuff. And he's like, he was very good at, here's the goal and go figure out the details. I trust you. And that's, I believe, just a wonderful way to manage. Don't micromanage people, set the goal, be there to coach and nurture, and let them have free reign. Let them go figure out how to achieve the goal, and they're going to go through that process. And Bob, when you look at how he managed people, that's how he did it. And so that break and fix role then evolved into a business development role, as then Symantec was growing so rapidly, evolved into an international role. So after a couple of years, Bob said, "Hey, we got all this international growth going. Mark, just jump in and kind of figure it out. Just go figure it out." And I had made a business trip in the very early 90s. Well, I can know exactly, it's 91, and I went over to the Netherlands. In fact, it was still 1990. And I went over to the Netherlands, and we had a fledgling office with 3 people. Guy named Dana Siebert, wonderful guy. I'm still in touch with. Dana lives up in Oregon now with his family. And Dana was running Europe, an American. He had a couple Dutch people there that had relocated from Silicon Valley back to the Netherlands, Margot van Verden and Chris Lewinis. And the 3 of them, and I was the 4th, we were the European headquarters for Symantec, just starting out. And then it quickly grew after that. We had a UK subsidiary, excuse me, we had a UK subsidiary, German, and a French in quick succession. We set all those up. But I was the 4th team member of 4, just setting up a European operation in a town called Leiden. It's really between The Hague and Amsterdam, birthplace of Grant, and it was a pretty cool experience. I I thought I'd be there a year, and I stayed for 7 for the first time back in Europe. Part of that time was with Symantec. After I vested, and I changed careers and went into management consultancy for a while, and I had another rocket ship ride with a different firm in that. But Symantec and its tech background was foundational in my career. Bob was foundational in my career, working closely with Dana Siebert, Margot, Chris. That team really grew quickly, supporting all of Symantec's European growth, and that was critical to my early success.
Guys, I hope you're enjoying this conversation. If you are, can I ask a quick favor? Podcasts grow through word of mouth, and chances are you've got someone in your network who get real value from this episode. So while you're listening, grab WhatsApp and share it with that person that comes to mind. It helps us reach more people, and it helps you pass on something useful. Win-win. All right, let's get back to the episode. What would I imagine there's again like loads of stuff, but what would Bob have said about a young Mark? How would he have described you back then?
Oh, that's a great question. He trusted me to just get things done. He trusted to, gave me a lot of rope. He was uh, he's a finance guy, but he was also incredibly smart from a business perspective. Laterally, he's had COO roles, CEO roles. He's been CEO in a number of startups, but he's been COO at some pretty big companies as well. So he wasn't a pure finance guy. That was his background and training. In fact, he started out in finance at BAT, at British American Tobacco. I'm doing this off of memory, but I'm pretty sure he had a classic CFO route. He got into Symantec quite early, and then he took it from there. Um, but yeah, I don't know what he'd say today. We talk about other stuff. We're still in touch, but probably my ability to get things done, my tenacity. But we worked really well together because he just gave me a lot of freedom to deliver against those goals, and he gave me a lot of trust and belief in me to just do that in the parameters of here's the goal, go get it done and figure it out. And if you get stuck, come ask me on next steps forward.
Yeah, it, it feels like one of those relationships that you kind of you put a flag in the ground and be able to look back year after year, and it's one of those big ones that kind of sticks with you throughout your whole career, but was really fundamental in all of the things that you've learned along the way. How did you guys meet? Did he interview you? Did you just kind of, he worked there and kind of just fell into knowing each other because of the teams? Or is it someone you sought out to try and work with? Like, how did you actually meet? Can you remember?
He had actually retained a search firm, and admittedly, it was a pretty low level job. And I don't know if I wouldn't call it executive search, but he had hired a recruiter, probably on a contingency basis. I don't know the economics of that relationship, but he had hired a recruiter that somehow got a hold of my resume, my CV, and said, I want to put Mark in front of you. And I remember interviewing with Bob, and it wasn't standard, kind of questions. It was very much kind of a simulated work environment interview process. So he wasn't asking me about, a set of generic questions. He was saying, we have this problem. How do you think about going and solving it? And you got to think on your feet, and you got to, you know, grok the problem real time. And I guess I said enough to impress him, and he made me the offer, and I jumped in.
And so then, how long were you with Symantec for whilst it was kind of all booming? How long were you there?
Coincidentally, it was my 4-year vesting schedule, and
Right.
it wasn't planned that way. I wasn't looking forward to being fully vested and punching out. Um, but those 4 years, I had transitioned from Cupertino, um, in Silicon Valley, over to Leiden. I had effectively moved, and I was living in the Netherlands, and then my second opportunity, also foundational, like extraordinary, equally as foundational as Symantec was. I was just looking for something new to do. I was wanting to be based in Europe for longer, and my father, probably as I said earlier, my original mentor, uh, my father introduced me to a fledgling consultancy based in the UK, where he had done some. They'd hired him to be kind of like a keynote speaker at like European wide conferences, and uh, they were called Butler Cox. And Butler Cox were a very early consultancy that combined a lot of business knowledge with technical knowledge. They wrote a lot of really interesting reports. They had an early subscription based report business, and he introduced me to them. They picked me up as a contractor. They very quickly got acquired by Index. Index was kind of this McKinsey-like consultancy that pioneered all the ideas around business reengineering. It was extraordinarily popular in the early 90s. Index then got acquired by a giant corporate called CSC, Computer Sciences Corporation. So I joined this little tiny London consultancy called Butler Cox, quickly consumed by Index, then quickly consumed by CSC. And then CSC was very, very successful in the 90s. They had an Amsterdam office, which I was attached to. The headquarters was back in London, which really where all the European leadership sat. Uh, so whilst we had a very small Dutch office, I was kind of jointly joined to the Dutch office as well as the UK office where European headquarters was.
Yeah. You must have had so we got on such a well disrupted one way, but like such a changing career in such a short period of time. You've gone from Symantec, you make you vest, you must make a bit of money out of that, and then you kind of got the horizons are open then, right? You could almost do anything, I would imagine anything that you wanted. And then you join this management consultancy where everything's moving fast, you're getting acquired again. I imagine you're being successful in there. Was there then people who helped kind of put their hand on your shoulder and helped you navigate Europe as someone who's made a bit of money in these businesses traveling around? Is there kind of people who helped you work out how to make good decisions?
So we had a great I had a great run at Index, and I'll call it Index. It's probably the best way to capture that experience. I had a great experience at Index. Um, they gave us a tool, and they gave us a tool kind of how to understand businesses and think about performance improvement on a business through a methodology called reengineering. And reengineering was all the rage in the early 90s. Index trademarked business reengineering. That was technically, I think it was a service mark, but they owned it. Um, uh, uh, Michael Hammer and Jim Champy wrote a famous book, Reengineering the Corporation. It was a business book bestseller in the mid 90s with a little controversy because you can dig into the details, but there was a little controversy how they kind of manufactured a business book bestseller. But nonetheless, it was still an extraordinarily popular idea. It was the big business idea of the 90s. Um, and I happened to be on this new rocket ship that was really taking off. The beauty of that was they gave us a tool set, and yet we were small enough and there was enough demand in the marketplace where I wasn't pigeonholed. And I know you've had a previous experience at Accenture, I believe. So I wasn't in the oil and gas practice in the UK. You know, I wasn't in a large consultancy, frankly, with a kind of a pigeonholed role. I was in a smaller consultancy that had rapid growth where I was deployed with a tool set and a methodology that was applicable across Europe. And so in the 90s, it was like I went and spent 18 months with an oil and gas company in Norway, and then I went and spent a year with a retailer in the UK, and then I went and spent another year with a financial services firm in Switzerland. And so as long as the management team's primary language was English, you know, I could really go and work in different industries in different countries and ply my trade. And that was an extraordinarily uh, important time in my career development to be exposed to so many industries uh, in so many different countries in a really rapid period of time. And the added benefit of that, and I'll mention my third big mentor in life. So the first was my dad. The second was Bob Dykes at Symantec. The third was John Rankin. And John was super influential as a mentor, both formally and informally. John headed up Index in Europe. Uh, John's a Brit through and through, lived out in Henley on Thames, lived out in Henley, ex, ex, oh, I'll come back to it. John was a career consultant, and we had a mentoring program at Index where senior partners were paired up with junior consultants and mentored them. And just randomly, I got somehow paired up with John. And then the third linchpin was John kept me on assignments that he sold. So we were small enough where every partner kind of had their group of consultants they would continuously deploy on their project. And so I had John formally as the head of Europe, looking after my career. And I had him formally being the partner in charge of projects he sold that he had put me into. And then I had him formally as my mentor, and he'd get me aside and give me advice. And so I had him at kind of at three different levels. And I, I say this kind of politely and not embarrassingly in any way, but I probably spent more time with John other than his wife Sally, maybe more than his wife Sally some weeks. I probably spent more time with John than anyone in Europe, just because he was my partner in charge, and he'd fly into Oslo and we'd have dinner and we'd get briefed on the project. And then the next day I'd brief him on the project. And then the next day we'd spend all day with the client. And I'd ride back to him on Thursday or Friday afternoon to the airport, to the old Fornebu airport. And we'd talk about the project. And if I was lucky, we were both flying back to London that night. I'd be on a plane with him. And I spent a lot of time with that guy and learned a lot of work and life lessons from John.
What was it about? What are the characteristics that drew you to him?
John was actually a Scot, and he was a hard-nosed, if you know the Scots, he was a hard-nosed, frugal, pragmatic, no BS Scot.
Yeah.
No BS Scot. Uh, Sadly, he passed away 7-8 years ago. He had cancer. But John was gosh, I had to write them down, but John had this thing called Rankin's Rules of Consulting. And he said, Mark, and he'd give me all these lessons, and I wrote them down. I could probably dig them out. I didn't think about digging them out for this call. But rule number one with John was stay ahead of the client. And he says, the moment they get ahead of you, you're done. If they get ahead of you, they're going to fire you. You're irrelevant. So you always have to stay ahead of the client. That was rule number one of Rankin's Rules of Consulting. But John said, stay ahead. So by February or March, John was saying, what's your summer plans? And that wasn't where you're going on holiday. What's your summer plans? What is the project that you've carved out for June, July, and August? So you're billable and you're adding value to that client. So you don't show up in May and they say, sorry, we're all taking off for vacation this summer, we're off on holiday, and we're just going to shut down for the summer. And then you're not re-engaged till September if you're lucky. Because if you fall into that trap of not staying ahead of them and not figuring out what the next project is and not selling the value of that project, and I'm not saying make work. John was always big about adding value. And that was another one of Rankin's rules and how you measure how you add that value. But he was already by February mapping out what you got to do to get something ready. So you're adding value for that next phase of work. So the economics of consultancy. So you're billable and you're not sitting on the beach for the summer. Because if you're sitting on the beach in summer, it's unpleasant. What John, I don't know if he instituted it or I think he might have instituted it, but every month billability was published and hard-nosed in pounds. You knew by rank. So it was within each, there were 5 levels of consultants, and within each level, what the monthly billability was per person as a percentage. So this is their daily billing rate. This is how many days they were billable. This is their percentage This is their month to year and or month to date and year to date. And it was a single, it was a couple sheets of paper stapled up, A4, and there it was. And somebody, it was a guy named Stephen Phillips, and he was billing 108%. And how do you do that? And nobody took the time to really reverse engineer that or figure that out. And Stephen was getting promoted pretty quickly. And so I got him aside, and I think we might have gone out for a beer or something. And I worked out that he had 2 projects, that the mathematics of that reporting was on a 40-hour work week. But Stephen figured out how to game it. And if you had 2 project managers and both bought more than 40 hours of your time, or collectively is more than 40 hours of your time, you could game the system and you could pick up one client for 24 hours a week, another client for 24 hours a week. You could be billing 40 hours a week, but the mathematics on that spreadsheet, that printed spreadsheet, was on a 40-hour standard work week.
Yeah.
Means you could bill 48 to 40 hours, and as long as both engagement managers are happy, all's good. And you're
Yeah.
going to get a higher billability rate, and you're going to get noticed, and you're going to get promoted. So I quickly adopted that formula and got promoted.
So you've had a few years then in management consultancy, you kind of gone on this, the company's going gangbusters. You're learning loads of things, learning about the industry. You've got some great mentors, people like John. I imagine that you fly up the ranks pretty quickly. You're pretty successful pretty quickly.
Yep. And that was all flying. It was the 90s, 1990s. And I had two other mentors that were really influential as well, besides John. And one was a guy named Roger Cameras, a Brit, and then a third was Richard Bowler, also a Brit. So John, Roger, and Richard were all senior at Index. Roger and Richard had come out of Butler Cox, so they knew me from that background, and they were a little more technical. And Richard was a bit of a cowboy, still is. And Richard said, "Hey, I'm going to go open Index in Sydney, Australia. It's a great lifestyle. It's a lot of fun." Richard was a real wine connoisseur, and hey, you got the Hunter Valley just an hour north of Sydney. It's kind of the nap of Australia. We're gonna have a good work-life balance down there. We're gonna have some fun. Would you be part of the team to relocate down there and join me? This sounds fun. This sounds good. And Richard he became a good personal friend, and we were scuba diving together all over the world and spent a lot of personal time together, weekends together, etc. And so I said, yeah, I'll sign up for that. And so and I got John Rankin's permission to go do that, and he thought that would be a good career step. So I transferred with Index down to Australia. This is about 1997. I remember that year well. It was 1997. I went down there, had a wonderful year. It was less travel. So the previous 6 years had been all about a human pachinko ball bouncing around Europe, and very much a stable day job where the clients were really in Sydney. We had a small office down in Melbourne, but it was really a Sydney-based practice, and it was a Monday through Friday job with very little travel. It was nice, and it was a great experience. I still have a rich professional network down in Australia, but and I would do it again. It was fantastic. But by late 97, the drum beats of the internet are on. We had just seen the IPO of Netscape, and we saw this new class of internet software coming out, and we saw the enterprise software industry really taking off. And I was already looking at things like the Red Herring magazine and Wired magazine, and um, I'm a voracious reader, and there was 3 magazines, maybe 4, 3 or 4 that really got my attention. One was the Industry Standard, 2 was Red Herring, 3 was Wired magazine, and there's something else in there. But I was just getting a hold of these. I was paying ridiculous amounts because news agents in Australia were importing them, putting like a $7 price tag on them or something when they finally showed up down there. And I was just, but to me, it was cheap. It was inexpensive to get the kind of knowledge I was getting. I was down in Australia for about a year, and then this internet boom is on, and I said to myself, I got to get back to Silicon Valley. I got to get back. And the the head of Index in San Francisco was coming down to Australia, and one thing led to another. And he says, I'm looking for consultants to get back here. And the Sydney business was doing okay. But when a guy named Jim Kennedy raised his hand and said, if anybody wants to come back, let me know. And I raised my hand, and within a month, I was on a flight back to San Francisco and went back, transitioned into a consultancy role in Index. But within probably 9 months, I had left Index after 7 years, and then made a successful transition into venture investing. So the internet boom is on, things are going gangbusters, and I used my international expertise, uh, combined with my business acumen, and there was a venture fund out of London, kind of had a unique model where they'd make an investment in a company, but then they wanted to build out their European footprint. So they had a executive search firm that would hire the VP of Europe. We would extract shares as an investor, and then we would extract shares for our VP of Europe. There was a transitionary model where they could hire the VP of Europe. So that business was extraordinarily successful. It was called Protege Group. Very, very successful. However, it was successful predicated on a bull market, right? It was only successful because 98, 99, 2000, we had a lot of IPOs, a tremendous amount. It was as many will remember, it was the dot-com bubble. And then after the dot-com bubble became the dot-com burst. So the zenith of that business was the 10th of March 2000. And that's when NASDAQ cratered. 10th of March, 1st of March 2000, or early 2000. I think it's 1st of March 2000. So the NASDAQ cratered and put a fork in it. That business model was over. Um, and and then I effectively then I just went into independent consultancy, advisory work. I've set up a couple of different brands. That Protege Group experience was, I think, about 3 years long. I was in that about 3 years, and in that time, we had a number of very, very successful exits. We had a $70 million fund where we then in 3 years had realized gains of 700 million. So we had a 10x on the basis on the amount. We had a 10x return on roughly, I think we made roughly 30 or 32 investments in that time. Kana, Net Gravity, Placeware, Artesia, Avantgo, a number of great enterprise software companies.
So that's your Arthur Rock book from early
Yeah.
on, going back around, and you then properly getting into VC or yeah,
And
building
I
and buying businesses.
and I sat in Silicon Valley at that time, and I was the one fronting all of those deals back into the European headquarters.
How did you learn it then? So people, that's management consultancy. You had a bit of interest in VC, I imagine, and kind of work out how it worked. But somebody must have helped you in that transition into really getting into the detail of how to structure a deal, how to spot a company. How did you learn that so quickly? Because it sounds like it happened quick again.
In that transition to Protege Group into venture, frankly, I didn't have a mentor that guided me. A bit of Bob Dykes, and there's another person there who's now at DFJ, who heads up DFJ Growth, Mark Bailey. And Mark said, you're going to be one step removed from the action. As a VC, the entrepreneur has a lot of the decision rights, has a lot of the decision making, and you're going to be one step removed. You can tell them what to do, you can give them perspective what to do, but ultimately they're going to get to do it. And both Mark Bailey and Bob Dykes kind of forewarned me of that. But there wasn't there wasn't a real, other than Bob and Mark, and then there was probably a few others I spoke to. There weren't a lot of other people that really gave me a lot of guidance into that sector. And it was, frankly, it was equally an investor role as it was a BD role. You had to convince people to part with precious equity. There's a saying, the best equity is the hardest to get. If a startup is too willing to give you equity, it's not equity you want. You really have to forcefully present a proposition that they're going to give you some equity. And so our approach was rather unique. It's like, look, you're still private. You're going to go public probably in the next year or 18 months. Open your round for us. I know you closed your round 6 months ago. Open your round for us. Let us in. Let us put $1 to $4 million to work, in the company. We're going to use that $1 to $4 million as a European budget. But the benefit to you is you're going to tell a much bigger story as you prepare for your IPO and you prepare for your IPO roadshow, that you've got Europe covered. The proposition was, this is Europe in a box. We're giving you we're finding you a high quality VP of Europe that's done it before. We're we're we already know the channels to sell software for you in Europe. We know the enterprise buyers. We saw a lot of packaged software back in that era. So we know the distributors. So we've got we know how to build the right team for you in Europe. We know how to build the right distribution channel. We know the priorities, what kind of countries you want to hit. We know the tax issues, the legal issues. We're the only game in town to really do this. Just open your round. Let us come in at the last round's valuation. If you don't have a forthcoming round we can participate in. We can't work with everyone. We have only so many slots to work with, right? Our resources are finite. And we want to pick the right companies. But that was really the way we shaped a proposition. And then you got good with a bit of luck, but you got good at finding those right companies.
Yeah, and you're able to offer them a multiple on what they're valued now because they've ticked the European box. In a whole new massive market that they've now got access to, that the day before they worked with you they didn't have access to.
Correct. And it could add 30 or 40% to your revenue in the next 3 years. And it could add 30 to 40% to your valuation. And I'm asking to just get in your round. And if you want me to talk to your other investors and put this proposition in front of them, which I did many times, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah. So you're there for 3-4 years. The bubble bursts overnight, seemingly, almost overnight, and you're then into the next 15 years of like individual consultancy, building your own kind of practice, your own reputation. What were those next 15 years like then? Because that's a completely different, a new start almost again. How did you? What were those years like?
So it was interesting. I left there, and the world had changed. So there's two tectonic shifts. One was the .com bubble, and then 9/11 hit, and they were those two events were pretty close together. The .com bubble hit first, and then 9/11 hit, and they were both rather significant, obviously. And I wasn't too thoughtful. I didn't overthink it strategically, but I just wanted to keep working, and keep the momentum going. So I started consulting to a lot of startups, and that consultancy was a lot of international expansion. Helping U.S. startups get into the U.S. and helping U.S. startups get into Europe. So I just kept going between those two models, and often simultaneously. And I knew the startup communities in both, and then that continued. And I was sitting on a plane. I think I was sitting on a plane, and very serendipitously, I was sitting next to a colleague, and I was explaining this. He's like, "What have you been up to the last couple of years?" I told him the startups. And he said, "Why don't you go consult again to big companies?" It's like, oh, I mean, a different sales model, different sales cycle. And he says, yeah, but that's where the money is. I said, yeah, but I'm doing this for low cash and some equity. And that was still panning out well. When you gotta, if you just yourself or a few people, you can build a nice consultancy model that's cash with some right equity, but it's a long game. You gotta get you gotta have a lot of, I called it wallpaper, but you gotta have a lot of you have a portfolio of equity and wait years till some of that cash is out, obviously. But I then said, yeah, you're right. Maybe I should dip in. So I started dipping my toe into large tech companies. And in parallel to the startup work, we built a really thriving practice on the enterprise side. So we started consulting to Microsoft and to Cisco and to SAP and to HP and to Intel. And so we developed a consultancy practice to big tech, and they liked that we had a practice in startups because it also gave them an eye and a window onto startups that they perhaps didn't have, or on the enterprise side, they didn't have it kind of with the perspective we did. So that kind of morphed, and to this day, we mix corporate consulting clients, even with startup consulting clients, and we go back and forth between those two. Each appreciates that we have a relationship with the other.
Yeah. So you're building that business over the next, those two different types of businesses all working as one. What's the team like? Who's the team that you're building around you, who you trust, who you rely on, who you respect, who you spar with? How do you think about building that team to make it bigger than just you?
Yeah, so the team, and I, for those that know me, I branded in the last, gosh, it's going on 20 years now. But I've really branded me, Mark, Maz. A lot of people call me Maz, my initials. Um, but I've really branded under three consultancies. I branded as Milestone Group, a lot of people know me for. Secondarily, 650 Labs, which 650 being the area code of Silicon Valley. It was kind of a play on words, 650 Labs. And then thirdly, and each of those brands kind of did slightly different things. That's why I had a different brand for them. And then thirdly, in the last 18 months or so, we've been branding as IC10X .ai. So it's an AI URL, but IC is the letters IC10X, but it's my eyes, I see 10X. So it's kind of a play on words on a 10X improvement. Our view, and the team is actually, there's three principals. One is a lifelong collaborator, ex-McKinsey consultant, Paul Vasitas, and Paul is based in London, and then the other uh, is based down in Melbourne, Australia, but he's a Finn, and formerly was the head of foresight for Telstra, and so it's a globally balanced team. Each of these guys I've known for 20 plus years, maybe a bit longer, and we just have a nice mix, nice skill set mix in terms of how we see the business side of tech, and in fact the tech side of tech, but the business side of tech profoundly evolving in the AI era.
Hi, guys. After enjoying this episode, please subscribe to the podcast. It really helps us in ways you wouldn't believe in getting new founders, leaders, and operators on the show, and share even more of the relationship playbooks that shape success. So if you're enjoying this episode, make sure you're subscribed. It really does make a difference. Back to the show. And as we kind of worked our way from college even and back at Symantec up to like where you're at now, it feels like there's like chapters. There's relationships that these guys are you with now, you knew them 20 years ago, and people kind of come into your life and you build relationships with them and you maintain relationships with them, but you're always you're able to go back multiple years, and it's like you're nurturing some relationships along the way, because in the future you never really know what might happen. Is that how are you intentional about doing that and keeping in touch with people that you work with along the way, or is it just kind of naturally how you work?
I'm extremely intentional about keeping in touch with people. I have a philosophy, and I don't, I'll, I'll give you a quote, and I don't know if it's mine or I heard it somewhere. I honestly don't know. Um, and it might be I heard it and I morphed it to kind of be mine. But I believe that relationships are the currency to get things done. The more relationships you have, the better off you are at getting things done. And the less relationships you have, the less you can get done. And the corollary to that, and this is not my own, movies have been written about this. There's a movie title with this name, and it's paying it forward, right? So I believe in paying it forward. You know, I know thousands of people around the world. You know thousands of people. I'm a natural networker. You know, I co-lead my 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 high school alumni group, and I co-lead the Index alumni group, right? I'm just a natural connector and networker. And you know, back to a comment I made earlier, I just have a good memory for what people are up to and what they're thinking about or what they did or where they went to uni or who they're married to. Or, you know, I'm really good at just naturally from a good memory of connecting dots. It like go back a long, long time. And I don't write it down. I just remember this stuff, you know, it's not
Yeah, what a
not
skill.
I'm not a savant. I'm probably on the, you know, I don't think I'm on the spectrum, but I got a good memory of just remembering, you know, I mentioned you're at Accenture, not hard to remember, but I just remember that in your background, and I could probably pull out some more stuff about our relationship going back over the years. But I'm just really pretty good at, and people describe me that way about pulling that kind of stuff together. So that relationships are the currency to get stuff done. The more you know, the more people you know, the more you can get that stuff done. But it's also has to be very intentional in the sense that you keep it fresh. So every week I just kind of randomly look at people on LinkedIn or social media and go, you know, I got to touch base with them. And so I say, hey, it's been a little while. I'd love to catch up, just 30 minutes. You know, I want to hear what's going on. I want to share some stuff with you, you know. And I'll just say, if you don't mind, just grab my calendar link and, you know, find some time, book in, and let's have a chat. And I have 4 or 5 of those calls every single week.
It's funny, isn't it? Because some people, I was probably one of those people. Certainly, people when they're earlier in their career, when people talk about networking, they think of it as like a forced go to like a speed date type of event and talk to people you don't really know, and that's not really what it is it? It's about actually building relationships with people where you're doing what you're talking about naturally, and actually having an interest in other people is much more is really what a relationship's about and a network's about. It's not about how many people you're connected with on LinkedIn or how many clicks you get on it. It's about the people that you'll then know something about, have a conversation with, you touch base with every now and then, rather than like how many followers have I got on whatever platform. And that's how you get stuff done. It's how you sell, it's how you market in a product or whatever the service is. It's how you get clients and how you're successful.
Exactly. And I've been to networking events, but in some ways those are too contrived and too forced, and in some ways they're kind of random. You know, it's just me, it's a big funnel or big hopper of people you meet, and then the relationships you nurture, and then the ones that kind of fall into that inner circle that are that are kind of more intimate, that are more sustained. Another element to that is in my inner circle is, and this isn't my concept, but it's a handful of reverse mentoring relationships where I have uh I have mentored some people, and their typical profile is their late 20s to mid 30s. They've gotten out of their MBA. A few have been interns for me, and I've just been so extraordinarily impressed with them that I've just kept in touch. And they don't know it, and I've never called it reverse mentoring, but we have regular dialogue, and I'm learning as much from them as they are from me. And I've never said, "Hey, you're mentoring me right now," but I'm pulling stuff out of them every time we chat, keeping my tool sharp, that's keeping my ideas flowing and going, as well as they think they're getting mentoring from me, but I'm getting as much from them in that regard as they are from me. But
And so the
one
funny thing was that they wouldn't know, would they? They wouldn't even know that that was happening.
one is a common friend of ours. Um, a young dynamic woman I have extraordinary time for. I hope Lola gets to hear this. But Lola, when I first met her at And Digital, where I was an advisor, as you know, for many years, I met her in London. I go, she's a rock star. She's going somewhere. She had a great run at And then she's got her nonprofit on the side around empowering African women. She's um, her family's Nigerian immigrants that relocated to London. She has since gone on and gotten a master's at Harvard. Um, uh, she's now rising through the ranks at McKinsey. And Lola and I talk every month. And she thinks I'm mentoring her, and she's equally reverse mentoring me. And rock star. Or I'd put Jenna Callan in that. Jenna is another. She recently got her MBA a couple years, 3 4 years ago. She got her MBA. She was an intern for me. Just head and shoulders, rock star above. Just a natural athlete, go getter, right? The right attitude, can do, gets it done, pragmatic, thoughtful. You just get energy off of Jen. She's just that kind of person. And I had, uh, you know, mentored her, and we talk regularly. But it's a reverse mentoring relationship. The stuff I learned from Jenna, the stuff I learned from Lola, and there's others like them. Coincidentally, guess who? Jenna also ended up at McKinsey. So not that I could spot talent like McKinsey does, but these are two mentor relationships that kind of grew into my inner network, where a lot of our interaction are now even on social media, right? And we're just interacting on Instagram. I think Jenna and Lola and I are also interacting on Strava, which is kind of a different facet of my inner network now, which is maybe we have a few minutes to touch on that. But we keep that stuff going with regular calls, and we keep that stuff going with just kind of interactions on different social media platforms where they post something and I'll all post something, and it feeds off each other. It continues that progression.
If they didn't know it, they're going to know about it soon.
Yeah, and
So
then
hopefully they both Lola and Jenny, they both see this and they hear it, because I think that's we don't often, these are the things that you don't often tell people. Or you don't say thank you, or you don't thank you, maybe not at the right time. It never comes up, but yeah, hopefully they're gonna now see that, and the amazing stories from both of them, and I'm sure they're getting enough as much from you as you're getting from them.
and they didn't know each other. And then they both ended up at McKinsey, and Jenna's just recently transitioned into a new exciting role. But I had actually put them in touch, and I said, "You guys got to know each other. I mean, just connect." And I put it later. I put them in touch with each other. But I've got a handful of people in my inner circle that are kind of that reverse mentoring role, and there's a few others. But I mentioned Strava, and how does Strava fit into all this? I've always kind of, I don't know, kept healthy. I've run close to 10 marathons. I've kept in general touch with myself, general in shape, I suppose. But I woke up January 1st, 2024, so 18 months ago, and I woke up on a beach in Cyprus. I was working remote out of Cyprus in Larnaca. That's another story. But I was working remote. I woke up, went for a run, and on that run, I was thinking about New Year's resolutions. And I had a birthday in 2024 ending in 0. And I go, man, I probably got to step it up, you know? 40's coming, 40's, something in a zero's coming, and I better step. And as you spit out your, wa- but I started thinking about, uh, what are my physical goals this year? Can I run another marathon this year or whatever? And I just started thinking about it in my head. And what started out as a little morning run as the sun came up, over the Mediterranean, then kind of turned in over the next couple days into what I call total well-being. And it wasn't about physical health, right? Physical health, yeah, it's important. I'm going to run more, and I remember talking to a good friend of mine, probably actually in my inner circle, guy I grew up with named Dan Anderson. And Dan Anderson, asked me how many push-ups I could do, press ups, push-ups. And I said, yeah, probably not very many, it's not something I regularly do. Now I do a few hundred a day. But my point is I had in a couple of days from January 1st, 2024, I'd kind of grokked my own hack, my own model where I said total well-being is about physical well-being, emotional well-being, mental well-being, social well-being, intellectual, spiritual, occupational, financial, environmental, and they're kind of building blocks. And at that first layer, if you don't have physical, emotional, and mental well-being, then it's very hard to layer on top of that social, intellectual, and spiritual. If you don't have those three on the next layer, it's very hard to then rock the next layer of occupational, financial, and environmental. And so I had really reframed all of that when I'd put that first in my life. It all comes. So, that's conversations about mentors and relationships and leadership and who you surround yourself with. That's what you're talking about on your podcast. But that to me is at the top level of occupational and financial. You don't have the physical, mental, and emotional. You don't have the spiritual, intellectual, and social before it. You're not going to get that work stuff.
How uh, how did that come up then? How did you kind of land on that? Well, there's the framework there, but what was like the spurring moment to think this is something that's calling you?
Well, like I said, I had a birthday ending in a 0 in 2024. 40. Let's just call it 40 for let's hold
Thirty,
that's a,
20.
that's a placeholder ish. And friends are getting cancer. I'd lost my mother and she lived to 85, but I lost my mother in 2023. But I was reflecting first on health. And I'd been on plant-based diet for nearly 10 years. About 8 years, I was on a plant-based diet. I was pretty good shape. But then I just had this epiphany that well-being wasn't physical, that well-being was mental and it was emotional. And we got to work on emotional regulation and we got to work on mental well-being. And are we in the right state of mind? Are we thinking about things the right way? And those that may have known me in my 20s or 30s or even 40s, I may have been more vocal about, I don't know, let's say politics, right? But then I kind of reframe that to say, you know what? Don't worry about things you can't affect. It might be interesting, but at the same time, you could dive so deep in that rat hole and waste a lot of time. And yeah, we all have strong views about it, but the reality is you only got 24 hours in a day, and do you really want to spend too much time on the debate, is it Labor or Tory or Republican or Democrat or and so it's like, yeah, all right. So on each of those buckets, how do you the whole view of my own hack is all that stuff is interrelated. And if you don't have one right, it's going to throw off the others. So you've got to find balance and harmony in all nine of those aspects. That's been my working, and you got to optimize all of them. And by optimizing all 9 and understanding their interrelationships, you're optimizing the whole. And that's why just focusing on physical doesn't matter.
I think like many, well, like has happened many times in your career and life in general. I think it's remarkable how you're able to kind of like get to the forefront of thinking and that provide a perspective on this is actually how you should think about this thing that everybody's been thinking about forever. But here's an entirely different lens on well-being, and it's not just about health; it's about all these different pillars that kind of all come together to create one full circle. And that's probably like a skill, along with your like your superpower of being able to remember things that many people forget. But your ability to kind of get yourself actually, it's a little bit back to, was it Bob Dykes or one of the other people you mentioned? Get ahead of the client.
That was John Rankin.
Right. So get
Yep.
one of Rankin's rules.
Yep.
It's a set, get ahead of the way people think about things to have a perspective and kind of reframe entire conversations in a way that's like remarkably engaging.
Yep. And by the way, that was a second corollary to stay ahead of your client was develop a point of view. And even if it's wrong, develop a point of view that you can adapt. And it's a corollary to staying ahead of your client, but always have a point of view. Always have a strong point of view on something. And over time, you'll substantiate with more facts, but it could be wrong. And then change your point of view and find the new facts then that support that new point of view. And it's okay to, to change, to change over time. But yeah, that new framework I say new, that was a hack. It's about 18 months old now. And I've completely reframed a lot of ways I think about all those different aspects. And I try to work on all 9 of those, frankly, every day.
Are you put so? How can people find out more about that in particular?
You know,
Are you publishing anything about it? I think you should. If you're not,
I haven't yet. I haven't yet. I'm still grokking the model. Um, but it leads to different relationships. It leads to different conversations. So when I put the total well-being out there, whom I follow and unfollow on social media is different. The lens now is this person or thing supporting one of these 9 things? And if they're not, I unfollow. You know, um, but so a lot of don't worry if you're in my personal network, if you're a personal relationship and we grew up together or we work together or we have some, relationship affinity in that regard, I'm keeping you around unless we're too politically noisy and then I kind of snooze you for 30 days, whatever. But I keep people I know personally in that. But whom I follow that I've not met, they've got to fit one of those 9 buckets in a balanced way or I just stop following. I don't follow anything that's not related to one of those 9 buckets for the most part.
I think that's really important with relationships. That's a really good example of it's actually okay to kind of move your career and relationships on. Some will come and some will go, and um, that's all right. That's all right because everyone's on their own journey. Everyone's moving from in a different direction. Sometimes you might come back together, like some of the things you've talked about. You've done some stuff, and then you find people you connect with early. But it's all right to be to kind of move on from relationships, and people don't think about the network that they build enough to be able to really think actually it's okay to let this person go because that was a different chapter of this particular career. I'll in a polite way, or it might not be said, but it might just drift. And it's actually okay for that to happen versus people thinking I have to keep in touch with all these people all the time. It doesn't have to be like that.
Yeah, and like a lot of people, I mean, my social platform, it's Facebook, it's Instagram, it's LinkedIn. Um, I'd had Strava, and people think of Strava as kind of a fitness app, but it's community, and it's community around a lot of this health stuff. And so I've always been a runner. I've always been a trail runner. Do a lot of hiking and mountaineering, and I love to be in the mountains. That's my heritage in Colorado, and I spend a lot of time in the French Alps and the Swiss Alps. And as you know, I'm a paraglider pilot. Um, so I've always, I Strava for me was a fitness tracker to begin with. I've more recently got a lot more into cycling. I've always done some cycling, but a lot more intentional about my cycling. But now it's putting me into communities of trail runners and road bikes and mountain bikes and hiking and all these other exploits. Some people I know, and I've got a probably a contingent of 30 to 50 people around the world that I know personally that we're pushing each other around physical fitness, but I know they have a broader view of health and well-being. A lot of them do. But there's a whole other community there that is putting wellness first, parts of wellness first, that I get a lot of energy and inspiration from. I don't compete with any of them. I'm a firm believer, and the only person you compete with is yourself, right? And this goes back to uni, but I remember an old quote: "If what you did yesterday still looks impressive today, you haven't done much today." You know, and so I don't know what kind of wattage I put out yesterday or the day before, but I got to beat it today. And of course you have rest days, or I don't know, what was my weekly mileage last week? I got to top it this week. The only kind of motivation that matters in life is self-motivation, right? Nobody's going to kick your backside to get it done. You got to be motivated inside to get things done. I said at the beginning of this, the only thing standing between me and a 2 to 3 hour run today is you. And so
Yes.
we're going to finish this up shortly, and I'm going to go head out for a long run in the mountains. Um, but uh, but that Strava community has become a really important support network because I know a lot of my close friends on there. So that breaks into people that I know personally and people I don't know. But the people I know, and we're liking each other's posts and we're commenting on each other's posts. But that's a like-minded community of people that I believe certainly are into. They've created habits around physical performance, physical output. But I know that they're on the edges of you piece together what they post on Instagram or Facebook. They're thinking about total well-being. They're thinking about other aspects of their personal life, and that's created a new community for me of like-minded people that I know Jenna's running her first marathon soon. I know from previous discussions her father had run marathons, and it's a big goal of hers to run a marathon, right? So I'm encouraging through Strava. I'm seeing her distances increase. I'm seeing her mile per minute decrease. And I know she's just competing against herself. And I know she wants to finish. And another good buddy of mine, Theodore, finished his first triathlon, and he's now trying to get sponsorships. So I know that his physical is moving towards financial and occupational, that he wants to be a sponsored athlete. No coincidence, he spent some time at McKinsey as well, after I'd first met him. And so all these people, they're morphing into parallel vectors, that I'm on. And so that it's not a fitness app for me anymore. It's a like-minded community of people that I know are broader than physical fitness.
Yeah. Oh, and I think it just reflects like a lot of your career and brings us all back to the beginning. You're extraordinarily good at connecting people and finding ways to bring people together around different topics or subjects. It might have been software in your early part of your career, management consultancy and technology. Now it's a bit sport and wellness. You find a way of connecting people. And it's a skill and it's a talent, but it's also just you can tell so natural for what you do and everything that you do in your life. I cannot any longer stand in the way between you and your run. I'm sure there's people who want to get in touch. What's the best way if people want to find you for people to get in touch or find out what you're doing?
Look, find me on socials. Drop me an email. I'm pretty easy to find on email. I'm pretty sure because I get tons of spam, but yours isn't spam if you reach out to me. Um, all the topics. If you've been listening this far, and besides family, I admire you for listening this far. But if you listen this far and you find me online, I'll certainly give you the courtesy of a reply, and we can start an online chat. But find me online, find me on socials, and I'd love to talk to anyone that aligns. If any of this resonated and you want to get a perspective, I'd love to have a chat.